I hope everyone out there is enjoying their weekend this Saturday, 26 November 2022, currently 1600 hours. That is, of course, 4 p.m. in the evening. For those of you in the civilian world, currently 77.4 degrees Fahrenheit here on the northeastern coast of Florida. We had a high today of 80.6 degrees and a low of 66. Barometer currently 30.05 inches of mercury and collapsing as we speak, just like the Chinese. Now, this is the story of the decade. Even with the most draconian lockdowns that one could imagine, COVID cases in China have reached record levels. They have failed. This is not being reported. Not here, not anywhere else. But if you look for it, you can find it. The BBC is actually doing a very good job of this. And they're asking the question. They're having the guts to stand up and ask the question. How could they have gotten this so wrong? I mean, we already know here in Florida. We've known here for a long time that lockdowns don't work. Even the worst lockdowns that were proposed here in the continental United States were nothing like what goes on in China. And even with what they're doing over there, record numbers of COVID cases being reported by the BBC. And the BBC is kind of known for being a little bit more liberal leaning. BBC News, record daily China COVID cases despite strict lockdowns, and they can't explain it. They cannot explain it. While at the same time, Ebola outbreak closes all schools in Uganda. Government is battling most widespread outbreak in history. Something else not being reported. Now, nobody is getting this. Nobody is putting this together. How could these two things be happening simultaneously? And since when does closing schools prevent the spread of Ebola? You have to be kidding me. Has everybody forgotten what happened not very long ago with Ebola and how they reassured everyone, oh, it's not airborne? It's not airborne. I mean, airborne things are like influenza, measles, pertussis, SARS, tuberculosis. Vector-borne things are carried by bugs, of course, like malaria. But Ebola, HIV, hepatitis C. I don't remember back in the 80s when there was the huge outbreak of HIV initially, anybody saying we should close schools to prevent the spread, even though one of the most lauded cases of it came from a 14-year-old in Indiana. I don't remember that at all. There's all sorts of guidance you can find on Google, official sources, CNN, facts first, that show clearly, unless somebody is symptomatic with Ebola and you're having direct contact with them, you're not allegedly at risk of getting it. Let me say that clearly again. Unless you are having direct contact, physical contact with either the body fluids of or the person itself that is infected with Ebola, you're perfectly fine. How does closing schools affect this? You see, they're keeping you distracted. We're going to go more deeply into that. I have an answer for all those questions, but of course we're going to have to do it over at Patreon. It's not something we're going to be able to talk about here because they just don't like it when you call them LIAR''. But that's what's going on. Right now, the world has turned into a bunch of zombies. You see, they're not ready to go out and go to guns, so to speak, to take anything from you, but they will. They will. And the real trick to being prepared is not having the things that you think you need. Have the things that you think they need. And that's a very different thing. I made this little collage of pictures long ago saying, are you ready for what's coming? Are you ready for the unpredictable? And what might be the ultimate outcome of what others may need versus what you might need? Many game makers and movie makers, they have this idea in their mind that, of course, everybody's going to need, primary, secondary weapons. They're going to need a big, giant vehicle like a armored Hummer. And there's some ideas on this page that are actually a good idea. Backup, extra footwear, non-combat inventory, things like lighters and bandages and the ability to have light and to, manipulate your environment around you. But when it gets down to the point where you have certain things you need, but not others, that's going to separate the survivors from those who don't. Because there's a thought process out there that not a lot of people, I don't think, have engaged in. There's going to be a lot of charlatans out there trying to sell you stuff, trying to make you believe that this works or that works, or, oh, you can't trust the government, but trust me, type of thing. Everybody knows in a survival situation out in the woods, shelter, water, fire, food, whatever, that's one thing. But in an economic collapse or a world collapse survival situation where you're still in your house, you may or may not have electricity, but your neighbors are all pretty much in the same boat you are. What will you or will you not be willing to trade for? Now, here's the thought process. This is the part right here that I think is going to blow a lot of people's mind. A lot of folks out there said, Florimaki, I have guns, I have weapons, I have tons of ammunition. Okay. Here's the problem with that. When you go to the trading post, because you have stockpiled all of those things, to you, those things at the trading post will be worthless. Meaning if you have a 9mm handgun and you've got 25,000 rounds for it at home, when you go to the trading post, you're going to look at 9mm rounds, for sale at the trading post and go, oh, worthless. Worthless. You would literally look at something and go, yeah, those are totally worthless. But that's only specific to you. Now, what would happen if the firing pin would break in your 9mm and you didn't have a backup or you didn't have a spare? Now, all of your 9mm is worthless because the weapon itself is useless. Or if some other part in the weapon would fail, a busted spring, anything like that, all of a sudden you've got to make a brand new plan. If the antibiotics you need, because somebody that you love is sick, are held by somebody who only has a .357 Magnum, he has no use for all of your ammunition or your busted gun. See, at one time it was worth something, but now it's not. So some might say, well, have as many weapons as you can, all as many different kinds. You can try to plan for every possible thing, but we know that we can't do that, right? There's just no way, logically, you could prepare for anything and everything. Like, for example, of the things that you have extra of, you would probably bring some to the trading post. Well, if you're living amongst like-minded folks, they're likely going to have stockpiled the same things you did. And so they will have the same low value for the things that they have a high quantity of. So that's kind of the weird thought process that really doesn't go to the top floor with a lot of people. The more you stockpile something, meaning the more you value it, the more you don't want to run out of it, the less it's going to be worth. Because it's not going to be something you're going to be willing to trade for or express any level of a shortage of. Some might say you can never have too much toilet paper or fresh water. I agree, but when it comes right down to it, there might be things that are much more important. Like, for example, the skills of someone who could repair a firing pin, if that's even possible, in a 9mm, or any other weapon for that matter. I don't know a lot of guys that stockpile a whole extra box of firing pins for their weapon, or a whole extra box of all the little springs or parts, or, the ability to do whatever to repair. Those are, pretty hefty skills. You see, that's just something that, long term, I think something like this would be a much bigger investment. You put up 3 or 4 zombie bars across any doorway, you might as well, anybody trying to get through might as well try to just knock down the wall next to it. Be easier than trying to go through the doorway. And these are super cheap. You see, sometimes video games don't do the reality justice because they never talk about what you have and what it's worth. You see, that's kind of what currency comes from. It's like, I don't know what I'm going to need or what it's going to be worth or when I'm going to have what. So that's why having something that everybody values. This is my argument with the gold and silver people. Not everybody values. I mean, they might tell you that in the TV commercial to get you to buy their gold and silver, but not everybody values it. Case in point, right here. I wouldn't trade for it. In a shit it's the fan situation, I wouldn't trade a single thing I have for your gold or silver. And I know lots of people that would be in the same situation. If you would have physical gold or physical silver, and it would be a grid down, power down, end of the world, shit it's the fan situation, you go to the local trading post where people have real goods and you try to trade gold or silver, you're going to get laughed at. Nobody's going to accept it. Nobody's going to take it. They'll probably take dollars. They take dollars faster than they take gold and silver over real goods. I don't know, what the logic would be between, with precious metals. I mean, you can listen to the guy on TV all you want, say they've never been worth zero. In a shit it's the fan situation with hungry people, they have. Absolutely they have. You can't eat it. But I'll leave with this, and I know this is going to seem like kind of a funny thing, but years ago, I think it's, 6, 7 years ago, World of Warcraft, I know it's like, Florida Maquis, it's an online game, it's this, that, and the other. One of their expansions was this expansion called Warlords of Draenor. Now, I know it's a lot of garbage and a lot of idiocy, but they did something really cool with Warlords of Draenor that gave you the ability to kind of war game situations like this. What was unique about the expansion of Warlords of Draenor was instead of you just creating a little fictitious cartoon character or whatever and run around out in the middle of nowhere and be a hero, is that in Warlords of Draenor, they opened up this new idea of garrisons. You could literally create your own little, almost tiny little mini town, behind a wall, and it was all specific to you. And you had to build certain buildings. Well, you didn't really even have to. You could build certain buildings, but you had to acquire plans to build those buildings. And the key is that you couldn't, of all of the buildings that were available to be built, you didn't have room for all of them. You see, you had to choose carefully the combinations of the buildings and the types of things that you had go on inside of your garrison. And if you chose the wrong combination, it just never worked. And depending on who you were as a character and what you did and what your role was, one character might have this group of buildings and it would work great, but the same character with just 1 or 2 differences, it would fall apart. A different character might have more success. You could literally go through almost endless permutations of it. And a lot of what you did ended up being having to trade for things. And you had to make sacrifices and trade-offs, and you had to build followers, meaning you couldn't do it all by yourself. You had to build a team. And it was really kind of a neat departure from what a lot of what World of Warcraft did, which was very solo oriented. You know, you versus the entire world all by yourself. This was a very kind of team group thing that you had to kind of build. And it was easy to make a mistake, build the wrong building. Sometimes you have to tear something down and build up something completely different. So anyway, it's a neat way to kill some time into kind of war game, end of the world survival scenarios. And it's one of the few games, and it was very, very, very detailed, right down to, growing plants and mining different things out of the ground and going out and collecting all sorts of specimens of things, combining them together, alchemy, and it's endless, absolutely endless amounts of things, fishing, all sorts of different fish from around the world, and then you combine them with different herbs, and it gave you different qualities and abilities to create other things. It's very, very complicated, but very neat. This was a neat version of, and like I said, this was 6 or 7 years ago, so it's a lot of expansions ago. So you might be able to get it pretty cheap online if you wanted to actually buy the box thing and get it for the computer. It's a lot of fun. And in this particular iteration with Warlords of Draenor, there wasn't a whole lot of excess violence, so you could probably get away with having the kids be part of it too. And, they could each have their own, and it would be something where they were actually building and creating something as opposed to tearing something down and destroying something, which is a lot of what World of Warcraft was centered around. This was actually building something useful and utilitarian that had some real-world application. So anyway, I will leave it there. But join us over at Patreon. We're going to talk a lot more about Ebola and what's going on. And I have a working theory that explains everything of what's really happening with Ebola and COVID. But once again, you can't talk about it here. $1, even less if you sign up for an entire year. Gloves off, fully refundable, lowest allowable level. You guys have heard it all. God bless. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you guys next time.